Hey everyone, and welcome to my 5-part series on PLAYERUNKNOWN'S BATTLEGROUNDS, Tips and Tactics. In part 1, we'll be talking about general information about the game, as well as tactics that can be used throughout every mode. Before jumping into a match, I recommend taking a look at your graphics settings, as well as your mouth sensitivity. This way, your computer can perform at its very best. On top of that, with these graphical settings, you'll be able to spot enemy players a lot easier, which ensures that you can make it to the end to get that chicken dinner. Now, I won't go into an extreme detail of what each of these settings do, but I will tell you what I'm running. Starting from the top, I've changed my brightness to about 86. Now, the reason I have this is probably because my monitor is a little weird, but that said, I would personally recommend always having the brightness slightly up, that way you can see within dark spots of the game and ensure that people aren't just hiding there. Heading down to quality of graphics, I've kept the screen scale at 100. Anti-aliasing I have at very low. Post-processing also very low. Shadows I've set to medium, this way the shadows aren't completely black, so I can see players who are hiding in them. But they're still good enough that I can see them in general, as well as not making them completely ugly. Moving on, I have textures at medium. This is also so the game's not completely ugly, but it's also not graphically intensive on my card. Effects I have at very low, this being one of the most taxing things graphically for the game, as well as foliage, also on very low. Even with foliage on very low, due to the last update, you should still be able to see foliage around you within about 100 feet. Also, with foliage being on very low, you should be able to spot players who are further than 100 feet away from you very easily, but we'll get more into that later in this episode. Lastly, and most importantly for the graphics, make sure that your view distance is all the way in Ultra. This way you'll be able to render as far as you can, so you can spot players who are out there on the horizon. And finally, just make sure that motion blur is not turned on, unless you really have to have it on because your computer can't handle this game. Now, I'm sure some of you, after me giving this overview of graphics, are saying, "Hey, Daniel, I'm running a super high-end computer. Why not just turn my graphics all the way up?" Well, here's my argument. One, I also run a super duper high-end computer, just built less than a month ago. But I constantly monitor the temperature of my graphics card, and without water cooling, it gets pretty high up. So I'd like to keep my graphics card's lifetime to be as long as I can get it. On top of that, with these graphical settings, you should be able to squeeze out those few extra frames that are pretty precious in this game. And you should be able to spot players a lot easier who are hiding in foliage or in the dark or even far away from you. Quick disclaimer, guys. Since recording this video, PLAYERUNKNOWN has optimized the game quite a bit, and NVidia has updated their drivers, so the game does run a lot cooler. That said, I still stand by my previous statement. Moving on to controls. For the general sensitivity of the mouse, I actually haven't changed anything on this. I find that PLAYERUNKNOWN'S is a game that sometimes taking it slow is a little bit better, and taking time with your shots and making sure that you can hit those targets is a little bit more important than just being able to snap around really fast and gun your enemy down. But, with that said, there are a plethora of options in here that you can change. For every scope, you can literally have a different sensitivity, which I personally haven't changed either, but based on your playstyle, you might actually want to look into this. Moving down to the controls on your keyboard, I recommend changing a lot of these settings based on your personal playstyle, as well as your personal setup at home. But there is one thing I highly recommend that everyone changes, just because you're playing on Steam, and that is shift tabbing. A lot of the time when you're running and you want to check your inventory, you can't do that. So what I've done for Steam Overlay is just switched it to Shift F1. That way, while I'm running, I can check my inventory. Next, I'd like to talk about character customization, just before you jump into the game. When creating a character, I recommend being conscious about blending in. So this means probably not any super bright colors on your character. Like, I wouldn't recommend wearing a super bright white jacket or super bright white pants. That said, I know my character has bright red hair, but most of the time I'm lucky enough to find a helmet so I can blend in. Now that we've gone through the basics in the main menu, how about we jump into a match? So first off, you'll notice that you spawn in a plane. Of course, you've seen it a million times most likely, unless you're brand new to the game and you've never watched a video, of course. I personally recommend keeping an eye on how many players jump out of the plane. This is to ensure that you're not going to land in a spot with a lot of players. One way to do this is by pressing V and using the first-person view within your plane to check how many players are around you. That said, know that there are two sides to the plane and you're sitting on one side, so you're not seeing 50 players on the other side. So, using a bit of first person and third person to gauge where you should go is important. Next, we'll talk about flying further, which means, say you see somewhere on the other side of the map, and you really want to go there, but the plane is very far away. What you do to close up that gap is press W to go forward, but then release it so your character stops, and then press forward again, and repeat this motion. Your character should rock back and forwards, and this will ensure that you fly even further than just holding W. On top of that, if you need to get across the whole map, you can always release your parachute early, and just glide down to the location you need to get to. Just remember, you do run out of momentum with the parachute, so you also kind of have to use that rocking motion to keep up your speed. Now that you know how to get across the map, let's talk about getting to the ground first, before everyone else. This way you can pick up a gun and just gun them all down, get it over with. First, let's talk about the altitude gauge that's in the lower left corner. This shows your altitude, how high up you are, and you'll notice that it drops as you get closer to the ground. But on top of that, it shows mountains that are underneath you, or small hills. This is shown by a black gauge that creeps up and down. If you see this black gauge, it means that your character will pull their parachute at a higher altitude. Now, this isn't always a bad thing if you're trying to land on top of a mountain purposely, but those few extra meters above the ground could be a few seconds for you, so you'd want to try to not have this black gauge. So now that you know what the gauge is for, let's talk about the number. The number is how fast you're traveling, your terminal velocity. And you want to try to get this between the range of 230 and 235. That's the fastest you can go. With that said, you want to make sure that you keep that momentum. And one last tip. You want to make sure you know exactly where you're going to land. So that means hopefully avoiding turning with your parachute, because that actually slows you down quite a bit. If you can just aim straight for that spot and get down there, that's the best option. Now that you know how to get to the ground, let's talk about where you should go. Now, this changes between every single game type, but I'm going to give you general tips on maybe where you should head to. Knowing the map is one of the most important things in this game. On top of that, knowing where things spawn, even more important. My general recommendation to everyone is to find that niche place that you do really well in. And don't be afraid to go to the outskirts of the map first to try to learn how to play the game. That said, the best things are in the biggest towns, military base, gun range, and so on. But also know that the most amount of people will be there, so you'll have to fight for your life. Here are a few locations that I recommend, that most of the time not too many players land in, but you're guaranteed pretty good gear no matter what. First, one of my top locations is the military tunnels. Here I recommend landing on the side with the little shit shack outside of it. The reason being that for this entrance there's only one way in and one way out. That meaning that there's only one way in. Technically there is one other tunnel that attaches to it, but you only have to watch two doors, so it's not too bad. For this location, when you get down to the tunnel that I recommended, if you are not the first one in, don't worry, go down to that tunnel as long as you're close by the other player, and run past him into the next part of the tunnel to go pick up a weapon, and then just wait for the asshole and kill him. Also, remember that the tunnel is kind of in a G shape, so don't expect the other entrance right next to you to be the exact next room. That is not the case. Next, let's talk about the gun range. Here, I recommend landing in what I call the maze, which is the left back corner. Usually there's a gun in there, and there's pretty good cover. Unfortunately, if you do not find a gun in the gun range, sounds a little weird, you're usually screwed, which can be the case, so be careful of this spot. But if you do make it out of the gun range, and you don't find all the items that you need, don't fret. Luckily, there are 3 small military tunnels around the gun range that usually hold the last supplies that you need. One of them is actually literally right outside the gun range, and the other 2 are within driving distance. Another great spot that you can go to is the power plant. This is located all the way on the right-hand side of the map. Here, you either want to land on the building that has 3 stories on it, if you land up here by yourself, or if you get there first. Usually there's a gun up here, so you can kill someone right away. If other people have gotten there before you, I recommend landing on the ground and checking the hangars or the small enclosures close by. Usually there's guns here, and if you do find one, try to hunt down the other people quickly and take them out. For my last recommended spot that's a little more quiet, I recommend going to the shipping yard, the one that's on the military base side. Here, you want to try to land on top of the crates, but once you have landed on top of them, there's usually plenty of gear up there. That said, be careful, people can be close by, and a lot of people run around in the mazes, but if you're up top, usually you can take them out. Unfortunately, if you're up top, you are also out in the open, so be very careful here, but there's usually quite a bit of good loot. And there's usually an escape with a car or a boat. The next step to knowing these locations is knowing where things spawn. So I recommend taking a few times of finding the location that suits you best, and knowing exactly where things are spawning. Now the question is, say you've landed, and there's no gun, but luckily you've landed first and there is a melee weapon. Is it worth picking up, or should you be looking for a gun? Now, I'm kind of maybe biased on this. Personally, the melee doesn't work terribly well currently for me, so I don't recommend picking up melee weapons. That said, I've actually done pretty well where I've beaten down 2 or 3 guys with just a melee weapon before they could get anything. Personally, I recommend looking for a gun first, but a lot of the time, too, you get beaten down even before you can fully reload the gun because the game's a little glitchy. So, this is kind of up to you. Pistols are worth picking up if it's the only thing around, and they can actually work very well as long as you're getting headshots. If you really freak out with a pistol, maybe just avoid them and go for a real gun, if that suits you a lot better. Now that you've settled in and taken out a few of your foes, I recommend getting to know each of the guns in this game. This is personal preference, but once you find the gun that really suits you, I recommend picking those things up. That said, if you find a gun that you might have more attachments for, maybe go with that one, but this is all up to you. Why don't we quickly go over what some of the attachments do. First off, bullet loops for the sniper and the shotgun. Just make it so you reload the shotgun faster. This is like a quick mag. A shotgun choke will make it so the bullets are in a smaller grouping, ensuring that you're getting those headshots. A vertical grip will make it so when you aim down sights, you have better gun control, whereas an angle grip makes it so you can aim down sights faster. A stock will generally reduce the recoil of the weapon that you are using. A cheek pad will reduce the vertical recoil, animation kick, and sway. A flash hider will reduce the muzzle flash of a gun, making it so you are slightly more hidden. A compensator makes it so the recoil of the gun is slightly dampened. And a silencer allows you to just straight up win the game. Actually, a silencer makes it so, of course, your bullets are completely quiet, completely with quotation marks, and it also gets rid of muzzle flash. In the beginning of the matches, I find picking up everything is usually worth it. This way you're not trying to backtrack and look for an item that you dropped or never picked up that you really need in this moment. Remember, with a lot of the guns in this game, there is select firing. This means that you can switch between single, semi, or full auto. This can be done by pressing B on your keyboard, and the UI down below the gun should change. Each of these guns have different damage per second, this factoring based on the bullet that they're using, as well as how fast they fire. Unfortunately, with the game's constant updates and it being an alpha, some of these stats are changing all the time, as well as new weapons being added in. That said, out of the assault rifles, the AKM using 7.62 and the M416 using 5.56 are the two best assault rifles that you can find. The M416, though, with attachments, ends up being a much better gun than the AK. Now, let's talk about aiming. In this game, there's two forms of aiming. There's first person and third person, unless you're in the hardcore first person only mode. For most of this game, I recommend playing in third person. This allows you to see a lot of blind spots you wouldn't be able to see in first person. That said, while aiming in third person, you are much less accurate. Luckily, one thing that they help you with is if you see this little red dot on a wall, it means that you're going to shoot the wall, or whatever object's in front of you, and not shoot around the corner, because it's hard to tell in third person. With this information in mind, I recommend you find the playstyle that works best for you, but personally I use third person for super close combat, and of course use first person for very long range combat so I can aim down sights. But being able to snap between the two is very important, so get used to it. Next, let's talk about scopes. Most of the iron sights in this game are pretty bad, so I recommend using scopes. That said, you'll notice that most of these scopes are not completely accurate. The example of that is if you find yourself an 8x scope, you'll notice that the zeroing is actually at 100 meters and not exactly at 0, which is a little inaccurate. So as of now, learning the quirks of the scopes is your best option. Next, we'll talk about zeroing a scope. This is how to get your crosshairs to line up exactly where the target is, depending on how far away they are. This is done by calculating how far the distance is and changing the zeroing of the scope to match that distance. That said, I don't really recommend using it because it's a little time consuming, so maybe just learn to aim up a little bit higher so that the bullet curves down from the gravity. Next, we should talk about picking up items. This can be performed by simply looking at the item and pressing F, or what I prefer, press Tab so that it opens up the full inventory of what's on the ground, and then dragging/right-clicking on what you need. With the recent updates, you'll find that right-clicking or spamming F isn't necessarily the fast option all the time. So try dragging and dropping. On top of that, if you have an item in your inventory, you can right-click on it to quickly attach it to the primary gun in your hand. Next, we'll talk about each level of items. For backpacks, 1 through 3 just increases the amount of storage that you can carry. For armor, this only increases the amount of armor you have, so you can take more bullets. For helmets, the armor increases from 1 to 3, but level 3 helmet is the only one that will protect your face. So, for level 1 and 2, if you get shot in the face, you will take 100% of the damage. Next, we'll talk about meds and boosts. These can be easily taken with the hotkeys on your keypad. With bandages, one strategy I recommend using, seeing how they are the lowest form of healing, is staggering. This is done by taking one of your bandages and then waiting for 2 of the ticks, and then taking another. This is because the item heals over time. So if all you have is bandages, using this strategy can at least get you to that 75% health. First aid kits will just guarantee you to 75% of your health, and a med kit will fill you up to 100. Next, we'll talk about boosts. These are in 3 forms. 1, an energy drink, 2, painkillers, and 3, adrenaline shot. The energy drink allows your character to move faster, as well as getting your health up to that 100% from 75. Painkillers will allow your character to flinch a little bit less, as well as getting you up to 100 as well. An adrenaline shot will get you 100% boosted for both effects. Now let's talk about vehicles. When should you use them? Well, for cars, I like to use them in the beginning of the match when I'm trying to get somewhere. Or, unfortunately, in the mid/late game of the match when I really need to get somewhere because the zone's about to kill me. That said, using a vehicle in general gives away your position highly, and if you're solo, you can only shoot when you get out of the car or when you switch seats. Well, how about a boat? Boats I actually recommend a little bit more than cars, but still overall I recommend running over both. But not many people will be on the water, and it's a lot harder to kill someone who's in a boat than someone who's in a car. Remember, all vehicles except motorcycles have a boost, so use this when you need to go up a hill or get somewhere quickly. But when using the boost, you are using up more gas. Next, we'll talk about the zone. As a player, you always want to make sure that you are within the white circle. So, luckily they've given you quite a few tools for that in the most recent update. Following the line, the dotted line, on your map will show you the shortest route to where you need to go. Also, the little man above your UI shows you how far away from the zone you are. Once he has turned gray and stopped moving, you are fully in the zone, so keep an eye on that if you're wondering whether you are or are not in the zone. Now that you know that, you should understand how the gas works. Initially, when the gas is coming in and it's on the biggest zone, it doesn't do that much damage. But if you are still outside of it, once it ticks into the white zone and shrinks back down, you will start taking more damage. Every time the zone gets smaller, you will take even more damage, and in late game, it will chunk away at your health very quickly, so be aware of this at all times. So, towards endgame, remember that your positioning is very important. Taking higher ground can be the difference between life or death, but the most important thing is knowing where your opponents are and making sure that they don't know where you are. Sound is a very important element in this game, and depending on what direction you are facing, you can hear where things are coming from. That said, if you're using the Alt key and free looking, remember that the direction in which your camera is facing is where the sound is coming from if you're hearing it from that direction. On top of that, footsteps are a very pronounced thing in this game, so having your volume at a good level allows you to hear your opponents sneaking up on you. One tactic you can use to find your opponents in a house, if you're worried that people are in there, is rub up against the wall when you're outside and you should be able to hear what's going on inside. Sound is a very important thing in this game, so I highly recommend using around-ear headphones so you can be fully immersed. Now let's move on to some other miscellaneous tips. Diving is also pretty important in this game, so if you need to swim across a body of water, I recommend diving. Just remember that this uses up your lung capacity, so every once in a while you will have to come to the surface. But while you're dived down, people won't be able to shoot you as easily. One way to dampen your movement is by crouching and aiming down sights. This allows you to walk a lot slower through a house and you will make a lot less noise. Another way you can be sneaky while you're outside is using the shadows in the game. These natural shadows will allow you to hide in the dark and away from your opponent. I also recommend closing the doors when entering and exiting a building. This makes it harder for enemy players to track you down. Remember, crawling isn't always the best option, even though it seems like it on your end. Just remember that the player who is 100 feet away from you or so can most likely just see you crawling on a hill with no cover. If you have the foliage all the way down to the lowest setting, there is no grass on that hill that you are currently crawling on for the other player. So it only really works when you're super up close on people, or if you have a lot of trees to cover you as well. Boosting is one of the most important things towards endgame. It can give you that extra second that can be your life or death, especially when the zone is on the smallest point and just closes in. Then it will just be a race for whose health drains the slowest. If you want to run quickly, remember to put your weapons away. This can be done by pressing X on the keyboard. One of the most important strategies I can give you is when you should attack. Now, this does depend based on which mode you're in, and a lot of the time I actually recommend sitting back and waiting slightly. That said, the best time to attack is when you know you can kill the person 100%. Unfortunately, when you engage in someone and they can get to cover, a lot of the time they will just get behind cover without you killing them, and then they'll know you're there, and most likely they will kill you at this point. Another great tip that I can give you is knowing when to take this game slow. Yes, I know this game is a very fast-paced game, but understanding when to engage and when to not engage, as well as where to move and where not to move, is a very important part of the strategy in this game. So, by taking it slow, you think for an extra second and you make the right decisions, instead of running in blindly and most likely dying. Knowing where to hide can be the difference between life and death. Personally, I recommend hiding behind rocks because they give you good angles as well as a much larger area to hide behind. That said, if you can find a house, I also recommend hiding inside of a house, but most of the time towards endgame, there's 0 houses around. Understanding the way peeking works in this game is also very important. What I recommend, if you have engaged a player and you want to push up on them, or if you need to get in the zone and you know there's a player behind an object, is to slowly walk forward, aim down sights, and just get ready to shoot the guy. He will have to peek you to shoot you, and in that time, usually you can shoot him in the head and just straight up kill him. If you have engaged with a player and they're hiding behind a tree, one strategy you can use to get them out or fool them from where the bullets are coming from is shooting the left side of the tree. This will make a sound that makes it sound like they're about to get shot or the shots are really close, and most likely they will squirrel around the other side of the tree and you can just shoot them. If you find yourself in front of a steep hill, try jumping up the hill. This is usually a faster method of climbing up. My last tip to you guys is learning how to cook grenades. Remember that you can cook them, and cooking them can get you killed, as well as you're able to put them in your inventory and drop them on the ground. But learning how to cook a grenade and time it perfectly can kill players instantly, so they don't have time to run away from them. The last thing I want to talk about is packages. Are they worth going for, and when should you go for them? Most of the time, I don't recommend going for them just because a lot of the items in them currently you can find in-game, so you most likely will not need them. And when should you go for them? I recommend going for them more when you're in a larger group, so duos and squads. And on top of that, I recommend going for them usually after the person has looted them, and you just kill them and take all the gear off of them. Because you're risking your life by going out there, and a lot of the time other players will camp packages. Overall, I stay away from them, but you can go for them if you really want to. Anyway, thank you for joining me for part 1 of 5 in this Tips and Tactics series. The next part will be about solo gameplay. If there's anything I missed, go ahead and leave a comment down below. If you want to see the next part, go ahead and subscribe so you're notified for when the next episode comes out. If you enjoyed this, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, a thumbs down. If you thought this information was useful, go ahead and share this video, it helps me a lot. And once again, thank you for joining me.